we are having another important topic, nausea and vomiting. You have to understand that nowadays there is a tendency to prescribe ondansetron for all types of vomiting. Whatever be the vomiting, the drug of choice is ondansetron, and uh, uh, we will understand whether that is true, whether we can use ondansetron for all the types of vomiting, and is it the drug of choice for all types of vomiting. Uh, we will come across uh, nausea and vomiting in not only in palliative care but also in general practice, and which is a very common symptom. And in some patients, it will be distressing. So it is important for us to understand what is the pathophysiology of vomiting and how we can manage vomiting and nausea properly. Uh, so this session will be taken by Dr. Sridevi. Dr. Sridevi is a palliative care physician working in Palim, India, and she has done her MSc in palliative medicine. Uh, she has also worked in Kasturba Medical College, Manipal. Uh, so it's over to you, Sridevi.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for the introduction. I hope my voice is clear, Raju.
Yes, Dr. It is.
Okay. So, as sir said, I hope I can touch few aspects of management of nausea and vomiting, and at least from now onwards, we'll start thinking about various management strategies that can be used in the management of nausea and vomiting. I think I'll be focusing more on the palliation of nausea and vomiting, but I think the theory aspects can be applied to any nausea and vomiting that you come across in your practice. So I'll share my presentation. So why should we discuss about nausea and vomiting? We all know that all the symptoms affects the patient's daily functioning, and you might have seen patients very reluctant to undergo chemotherapy because they are very scared of this and vomiting. Because when you hear about the word chemotherapy, patients will relate very well to nausea and vomiting, and so at least some of them we see on a regular basis that they are scared of vomiting and they don't want to go for chemotherapy. Uh, and it affects the quality of life really badly, not just the patient but the whole family, because the family wants to feed the patient but the patient keeps vomiting continuously, and patient becomes tired, and the family members will become more distressed, don't know how to manage this patient. And another important problem that we also face is like when they have continuous vomiting or nausea, they will be unable to take medications, or sometimes the moment they take medication, they will vomit everything out. So there can be poor absorption of medicine, or the patients feel that I might have vomited, so I don't have enough or good symptom control because of my vomiting. So it is a two-way distress symptom for even the care provider as well as for the patient. So it is not just in cancer. When we talk about nausea and vomiting, the moment we have a tendency to relate it to cancer, but it is not just in cancer. I don't know how many of you deal with HIV patients. They have all these symptoms of nausea and vomiting at many stages of their illness, starting from sometimes the diagnosis starts with diarrhea and vomiting, heart disease, end stage heart disease, and end stage renal disease. So all these illness has a high prevalence of nausea and vomiting, not just in cancer. So the objectives would be to reduce as much as possible to stop nausea and vomiting, or to at least to reduce the frequency. Sometimes it may not be possible to stop the vomiting completely, so we may have to negotiate in between that. We have to reduce the frequency, and to establish the compliance of treatment. The moment nausea and vomiting is controlled, some people will be happy to go for treatment like chemotherapy. They'll be more compliant to take medications. It's easier to manage that way. And ability to administer oral medications means the patient can be managed at home. But if the patient is having continuous vomiting and you have only the option of systemic medications like IV or subcutaneous, then the patient has to be admitted in the hospital. So that is a real distress for the patient and the family. So continuity in the oral medication is another goal that we can achieve. And above everything, we always focus on improving quality of life. Just give me a moment. Yeah. So this is a different definitions of nausea, vomiting, and retching. We tend to club it together, or sometimes the patient's symptoms we just take it as vomiting. So you have to be very clear what you are asking for and what you are looking for. So what is nausea? Nausea is just an unpleasant feeling, the need to vomit, but they may not actually vomit. But there will be all these autonomic symptoms like pallor, cold, sweat, salivation, tachycardia, everything will be there. But the patient will not vomit contents out. So when the patient is telling you vomiting, you have to be really specific whether it is nausea or vomiting. So we have to ask it very clearly. For that, we must know what is the difference. So vomiting is a forceful expulsion of gastric contents. So there is something really they are bringing out, and vomiting gastric contents out in vomiting. Retching, patients always can get confused with vomiting and retching. So you have to understand what is a local term in your language that they use for retching and vomiting. Retching is a rhythmic, labored, spasmodic movement of the diaphragm and the abdominal muscles. So sometimes they may feel that the abdominal contents have reached till the throat and it just went down. So they may explain it in different terms. So we have to understand what is a local term used for retching and nausea and vomiting. So these three are the definitions. So what I will be focusing on, so you have learned a little bit about symptom management, I guess. So whatever symptom management we do in palliative care, the first thing we would focus on correcting the cause, to understand why this patient is having pain, or why this patient is having breathlessness, why this patient is vomiting, is a primary thing to start with. We have to start thinking about the cause initially. And along with the pharmacological measures, it is very, very important to look for non-pharmacological measures. Sometimes very small tips done by our nurses can make a magic in terms of symptom control. Very, very small changes in their daily routine, or even a small position change, can bring about a lot of change. So emphasize on non-pharmacological measures along with pharmacological interventions. And the third important part I would like to emphasize on is dietary modifications. In our culture, we know that I don't know, I know that there is a different group of people from different parts of the world. But in the place where I come from, if you don't eat rice, that means you are starving, irrespective of whether you eat something else. But if you don't eat rice, then that means the patient have not eaten. So sometimes dietary modifications play a major role in controlling nausea and vomiting, and it has a lot of sentimental effect also in terms of feeding for the family members. So we have to be very careful about the modifications. And fourth one, which I will be describing in detail, about receptors at various sites and the appropriate antiemetics. Not just any antiemetic, as Dr. Sunil was mentioning. There is no one single antiemetic that can be given for any nausea and vomiting, which is a very common practice. The moment you tell vomiting, you will get an ondansetron. So our aim is to understand what are the receptors involved in the emetic pathway, and what are the drugs that can be used to block this. So I'll go to the non-pharmacological measures. First thing would be to avoid situations which induce nausea and vomiting. Large amount of food in front of a patient who is already nauseous will make him more nauseous, thinking that I have to eat the whole plate full of meal. So avoid such situations. Smells. Sometimes people don't like some particular smell coming out of the kitchen. So if possible, we can avoid that. And fresh air is really important. Many of the homes, our patients in Kerala, they live in a very congested places, not much space inside the home, and a lot of clothes will be there, used clothes, utensils unclean. So the fresh air is a big problem in many places. So ensure that the patient is in a place where he can get some fresh air, maybe near the window. And it is for all symptoms. You might have noticed for pain also we need some fresh air, and patient needs a calm environment, even for breathlessness. So it's really important in managing any symptom. And feeding in the upright position as much as possible. Many patients will be lying down, and the caregivers, out of love, they'll be feeding when the patient is lying down. So that is one point that we can stress on. Oral hygiene is a very neglected part, because when you have a continuous vomiting or nausea, and just in case if you are under multiple medications and treatment, anti-cancer drug, retroviral drugs, the oral hygiene is really, really compromised. And that itself can give rise to nausea and vomiting. We tend to overlook. We don't think that this can actually cause nausea and vomiting, but good oral hygiene and hydration is really important in managing nausea and vomiting. And many a times patients will be having fungating wounds or bed sores or colostomy. So the smell from those wounds itself can be a reason for nausea and vomiting. So that is one thing that we can avoid. And if possible, suitable distractors. I believe that frequent small meals work. If you give a plate full of meal to a patient, he may not be able to think about eating. The moment he see the plate, he'll be reluctant to eat. So if you tell them just have 2 spoons, then that is a very small task. So then they'll think, okay, it is just 2 spoons. Let's try it out. So, and after 1 hour, you can try something different, 1 or 2 spoons or 1 or 2 sips. So it is easier for the patient to accept the food, and there won't be much of the symptoms. So small frequent meals, other than following the clock like breakfast, lunch and dinner and tea in between. So I tell them to have small meals every 1 or 2 hours, and avoid carbonated drinks. Many people tend to have sodas and juices, the artificial juices, when they have these symptoms, maybe because they want that mixed taste over the tongue, but usually it ends up in vomiting. And usually people like rice gruel. In our place they like to eat kanji, or rice gruel, or any clear fluids, tender coconut water. People tolerate it much better than any other drink. So yesterday I remember one patient came. He has continuous nausea, not vomiting, but the wife is asking, as he is having nausea, he's not eaten for 2 weeks. So she's telling 2 weeks not eaten. So I, how can that be possible? So I asked, so what all did you had today morning? So it's, he's eating in terms of drinking. He's having semi-solid or fluid like diet. But when you don't eat solid food, that means no eating. Then the wife wanted to feed him protein drinks. So they brought some high expensive protein drinks, and which is totally not palatable. And by the moment the patient's wife was telling about the protein drink, he was like, hearing that name itself, I feel nauseous. So that is very important part that we need to address. Before starting your prescription, you need to ask which all food they are giving, which all things he would like to have, and how much quantity they give at a time. So that is the management starts with that. And then only you think about what medication, what receptors. So I hope I'm clear till then. And then now we'll move on to pharmacological measures. Uh, Afternoon time, it is not very pleasant to bombard you with a lot of receptors and vomiting centers, which we all might have left in, I think, I hope, with the physiology classes in the first or second year of medical education. But I'm really sorry, but I have to bring this up again in an afternoon session. Remember 5 key players in this management. The one would be vomiting center, which is a key player among the 5, and CTZ, chemoreceptor trigger zone, gastrointestinal tract, cerebral cortex, and vestibular nucleus. So these are the 5 key players that we are going to deal with today. So just remember these 5 people involved in the mechanism of vomiting. So where are they situated? I know everyone knows this basic information, but just to brush up our memory, where is vomiting center? Vomiting center is located in the medulla, and it is a final common pathway of emetic pathway. And it is made of lot of interconnecting neural network. I am not reading everything. You can read from the PowerPoint. Chemoreceptor trigger zone, where is the, it's a very common term used when you deal with the chemotherapy drugs. So chemoreceptor trigger zone, it is located at the, near the fourth ventricle. And the very important part, the one thing that you want to remember is that it is positioned outside the blood-brain barrier. So what happens? What is the relevance? As it is positioned outside the blood-brain barrier, it is accessible to emetic substances in the blood or cerebral fluid. So any of the toxic substances or any of the abnormalities happening in the blood can actually have an effect in the CTZ because there is no blood-brain barrier. So it is commonly termed as chemoreceptor trigger zone. That is one point that I want you to remember from the CTZ. And GIT, we know that we have local mediators from ECF cells, and they give signals to the brainstem either directly or through the vomiting center or through the CTZ. Cerebral cortex mainly deals with the memory, fear, and modification. For example, as a child, I used to vomit very frequently when I travel. But even the thought about traveling makes me fearful about the vomiting episode. So that is one example that I can remember, I can think of. So any memory, fear, or modification mediates through the cerebral cortex, and any vestibular nucleus, any vestibular balance or movement related issues can go through the vestibular nucleus. So these are the 5 key players: vomiting center, CTZ, stomach or proximal bowel, that is a GIT, cerebral cortex, and the vestibular nucleus. So we will just go through the various receptors and what are the neurotransmitters involved. So these are the main neurotransmitters involved in the emetic pathway. First one will be dopamine. So we know that there are 5 types of dopamine: D1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'll just, so the D2 receptors are present in the CTZ and another CTZ as well as in the GI tract. I have just highlighted the points so that you can just memorize those. So D2 receptors are present both in the GIT and in the CTZ. And D3 receptors are present centrally, and it is associated with genesis of emesis. Next one would be serotonin. So we heard dopamine, 5 types of dopamine. The important ones are D2 and D3. Serotonin, 5-HT1, 2, 3, and 4. There are 4 types of serotonin receptors. 5-HT3, it is very commonly we talk about 5-HT3 receptor, which is present in the gut and CTZ and in the nucleus of tractus solitarius. 5-HT4 is seen in GI. So here we are dealing with 5-HT3 and 5-HT4. I'm just mentioning about the common receptors involved, but if you read much deeper, you will see there are many other mechanisms also involved in the recent studies. So 5-HT3 in the CTZ, gut, 5-HT4 in the gut. And the other receptors like tachykinins and neurokinins. I'm not reading all the names like substance P, neurokinin A and B. You can just go through the notes when you get your point. And there are other neurotransmitters involved in the vomiting, mainly histamine, acetylcholine, GABA, cannabinoids. These are all involved in the genesis of vomiting. But I want you to remember mainly dopamine and serotonin. So this is how the emesis pathway interacts. So you can see, can they see my cursor, mouse cursor, Arun?
Yes.
Yeah. So you can see what happens when there is an abdominal radiotherapy or if there is an intestinal distension. What happens? Both acts at the 5-HT3 receptors in the gut wall. So in this picture, it is easy to relate. What happens when you undergo chemotherapy? When you undergo chemotherapy, you have drugs in your blood. It can act at the 5-HT3 receptors in the gut wall as well as 5-HT3 receptors in the CTZ. What happens when you give morphine or drugs like digoxin? It acts as the D2 receptors in the CTZ. So every in this picture, I think almost most common causes I have mentioned. As I mentioned, fear and anxiety. What happens when you are scared? What is the area involved? Cerebral cortex, hyponatremia, raised intracranial pressure. So this is the center involved, which will conduct signals to the higher center. Movement related or vertigo, vestibular nuclei is involved. So these are the common causes of vomiting that we see in a palliative care setting. I have tried to summarize this in that picture. So this picture uh, was very useful for me because we can just look at the picture and connect why this patient is vomiting. So we'll go to the various antiemetics that is commonly used in a palliative care setting. So what are the drugs? What are the type of drugs that can be used in, what is the class of antiemetics that can be used when you think that vomiting center is involved? Antimuscarinic drugs, antihistaminic drugs, 5-HT2 and NK1 receptor antagonist. So I have mentioned various drugs which has been used. Cyclizine and levomepramazine is not available in our country, but I know that there are participants outside India, so I'm not sure whether they have access to all these medications, but it is not available in our country. And chemoreceptor trigger zone, you know that now we mentioned D2, 5-HT3, and we can see the drugs which helps in blocking. I'll be coming in detail to the drugs, so that is why I'm just going through these headings. And cerebral cortex, we know that benzodiazepine, cannabinoids acts at the cerebral cortex level, and these will be the drugs used in the in managing that vomiting. Prokinetic drugs, mainly we use metoclopramide, which is a 5-HT4 antagonist at higher doses, and at the doses below 100 milligram, it is a D2 receptor antagonist. There are many anti-secretory drugs that we use to reduce the secretion and reduce the vomiting. Very commonly used drug is hyoscine and octreotide. Anti-inflammatory drugs like dexamethasone, and this 5-HT3 receptor blockade very commonly used in chemotherapy-induced vomiting, which is mainly ondansetron and granisetron. So just try to bring in some mnemonics. What are the causes of vomiting? Vomiting can be used to metastasis to liver or metastasis to brain. So when there is a metastasis to brain, there will be raised ICT. So there is a fluid buildup which can cause vomiting, where we'll give steroids and mannitol to reduce the intracranial tension. Same thing with the liver. When you have a metastasis to liver, there will be toxin buildup and there will be edema. So we tend to give steroids, which will reduce the vomiting. There are meningeal reasons where you have a leptomeningeal disease or raised ICT. The same management will give steroids. Vomiting can be due to many medications that we use. What are the commonly used medication in palliative care? Opioids. So we know that tramadol, tapentadol, and morphine, all the opioids are known to cause some amount of vomiting and nausea when you start, which is reversible. So where what happens there when you give opioids? What are the centers involved? CTEZ, vestibular center, and GI center. So the drug of choice would be metoclopramide. So metoclopramide acts both at the dopamine and 5-HT4. At lower doses, below 100 milligram, it will act as a D2 receptor antagonist, and higher doses, it will act at the 5-HT4. Haloperidol again is a potent D2 receptor antagonist. And here we have chemotherapeutic drugs. Where does it act? Usually it acts at the CTZ and GI, the serotonin receptor. So we need something to block the serotonin receptor, that is ondansetron. NSAIDs can cause gastritis, and it also acts at the CTZ. So we can give PPIs to reduce the gastric effect and ondansetron. This is just to summarize what are the causes that we see. So everything starts with M. Movement, any movement inducing vomiting. We know that vestibular stimulation, usually seen in morphine, many patients with morphine, and promethazine will be the drug of choice. Cortical activity, your mentation, your thought process. It is a centrally acting mechanism where you are scared about vomiting or you are anxious about vomiting, then lorazepam or GABA receptor is involved. Mechanical, any constipation or any distension, any luminal distension, or any tumor obstructing the bowel wall, extraluminal pressure. So this can all lead to vomiting. So then we have to manage accordingly. We'll be coming in detail about constipation and bowel obstruction management later. There are many metabolic causes to vomiting. Hypercalcemia can cause vomiting. So so it's really important when you see a patient, you have to think about all this, whether Suppose a patient is coming to you with multiple bone metastasis, then you have to think whether this patient is hypercalcemic or what. He has pain, nausea, vomiting. Think about hypercalcemia. Check whether he has his calcium, how his calcium levels are. So by correcting the hypercalcemia, we'll be able to control the vomiting rather than just giving some prescription of an antiemetic. We have to know why this particular patient is vomiting, whether there is any hyponatremia, whether his liver functions are okay, whether we can correct something. And if the patient is on opioid, we need to think whether it is opioid related vomiting or is it something else. And you might have given an NSAID, so there can be chances of gastritis or GERD. Then we have to act accordingly. There is no single solution for nausea and vomiting. We have to think why this particular patient is vomiting. As I mentioned, candidiasis is very, very prone to cause all these symptoms: anorexia, nausea, vomiting. So check the oral cavity. When someone is telling you, I have unpleasant taste, or I feel like vomiting when I think about eating. And sepsis also can present as nausea and vomiting. Then you have to prescribe appropriate antibiotics. I know that it is too much of information in terms of receptors and drugs, but you have to read it one or two times to, and then you have to actually put it in your practice. Once the patient is telling you there is nausea and vomiting, think about all this, keep a small note with you, and then try to apply the drugs and receptors. Then you will learn by practice. It will take some time to get that hang of receptors and the centers, but I'm sure this is really, really helpful. And you can actually play with a lot of drugs with this knowledge. So we know that the how to approach a patient with any of the symptoms. First will be a proper assessment. Then I said correcting the correctable. Very commonly we see people don't check all these electrolytes or anything when the patient is telling you vomiting. You think that this can be due to chemotherapy, but it may be due to something else, which is clearly correctable. And manage the consequence of complication and provide targeted therapy. Choose appropriate. I always use the word appropriate antiemetic. Don't just use any antiemetic. You have to understand what is the appropriate antibiotic for this patient. Route is very, very important. Patient is telling you, I am continuously vomiting, I can't even take water, I can't even take tablets, and you prescribe tablet and send them home, there is no use. The tablet is going to be vomited again. So choosing the route is also very, very important. You need to think about an alternate route. And attention to details. Attention to details, you have to cover everything. PQRST we have learned in pain assessment. Everything applies to nausea and vomiting. What was the color of vomiters? When did the patient vomit? Is it immediately after food, only with food intake, or with or without food intake? After what time? What is the color? What is the volume of vomiters? How much volume it is? So everything you have to ask, not just recording he has nausea and vomiting, but is it associated with nausea, or is it a sudden abrupt projectile vomiting? Was there a headache? Was there anything else like constipation? Have you been taking any NSAIDs from, because in our place we can get NSAIDs anywhere from the medical shop, so we don't know what kind of medication they might be taking. So you have to ask everything, PQRST, in terms of nausea and vomiting assessment. What are the relieving factors? Do they feel relieved after vomiting, or still the nausea and vomiting sensation persists? So these are all really important to understand what medication that you are going to prescribe. Examination, abdominal examination, look for bowel sounds, check for any organomegaly. If needed, do a rectal examination, and check for any other metabolic abnormalities if you think that that can be the reason for vomiting. Usually we may not go for much of the investigations other than electrolytes or just to check whether there is any metabolic abnormalities or to rule out sepsis. So I'll just talk about the commonly used drugs in palliative care. So this is the one of the commonly used drug, which is metoclopramide, and usually given for nausea and vomiting associated with opioids. And when you are suspecting a dysmotility, because you know that metoclopramide is a prokinetic, it will increase the motility. So when you are suspecting a decreased motility, you have to think about metoclopramide. It is a As I mentioned, it is a D2 antagonist, but along with that, it has a 5-HT4 action also at a higher dose. So even if you are planning to give metoclopramide for a chemotherapy-induced vomiting, you have to go for a higher dose. Prokinetic agent, it is a prokinesis due to its cholinergic effect in the gut, and it is usually prescribed for opioid-induced vomiting. And I hope everyone is familiar with the dopamine brake that you have in your gut, and this D2 antagonist, that is metoclopramide, block the dopamine brake. So you have a brake there. The D2 antagonist, the metoclopramide, will release that dopamine brake on gastric emptying. And it is mainly used for patients where you suspect gastric stasis or an intestinal obstruction, especially partial intestinal obstruction. I'm not reading the bioavailability and stuff. It is good, reasonably good oral bioavailability. So it can be given in orally or IV or subcutaneous. I emphasize on subcutaneous because that is the most commonly used route than IV. So it can be given subcutaneous. You have to be careful when you are giving for a long period of time higher doses. Some people can have extrapyramidal side effects, and not really common, but yes, if you go up to higher doses for a prolonged period of time, be cautious when you give metoclopramide to a patient with Parkinson's. But that does not prevent me from prescribing metoclopramide, but I'll be just keeping in my mind to check whether there is any exacerbation of symptoms. There is no absolute contraindication. Just to keep in the back of mind, you have to make sure that the patient is not having any exacerbation. And if you're suspecting a complete obstruction or a GI hemorrhage or perforation, you have to be really careful because it can aggravate the existing situation. Metoclopramide cannot be given, should not be given in complete bowel obstruction. So that why you can't give we'll deal with that when you deal with bowel obstruction. And in the red ink, I have written specifically, do not combine metoclopramide with any of the antibuscarinics, especially buscopan, because it has opposite effect. And I've written it red because it is not that uncommon. People prescribe both together, and there is no use of giving such combination. Dopamine as domperidone is another D2 antagonist. It does not normally cross blood-brain barrier, but it has action on the CTZ. We know that there is no blood-brain barrier in the CTZ, so it mostly acts on the D2 receptors in the GI tract and the CTZ. Very commonly used, but it is less potent than a metoclopramide, and it doesn't have much of a prokinetic action. So we prefer metoclopramide over domperidone, especially when it is a motility-related vomiting. It has less side effects than metoclopramide, less side effect in terms of extrapyramidal activity also. But again, you cannot give that in a complete obstruction scenario. And there is not much adverse effect except mild colicky pain that patient may complain when they have a gas motility issues. So the other commonly used antiemetic, I'm telling antiemetic, is haloperidol, which is a typical antipsychotic drug, but it is a pure D2 receptor blocker. So in doses of 1.5 to 5 milligram, or we start with 0.5 milligram is also fine. It is a very good antiemetic, although it is primarily used as an antipsychotic. Olanzapine is another atypical antipsychotic, which is a broad spectrum antiemetic. It has affinity for multiple receptors, D1, D2, D4, many serotonin receptors, alpha-1, histaminic, cholinergic. So it is a very broad spectrum antiemetic, very effective for refractory nausea and vomiting. And 5 to 10 milligram per day by mouth is the dose for olanzapine. I just put levomethomazine because I don't know whether if that is available in your country. Then levomethomazine is a very good antiemetic with a D2 receptor antagonism, and it is usually a second line and third line management in refractory nausea and vomiting in many countries. And I've never seen antiemetic dose is 6.25 to 25 milligram twice a day. And I have seen when from in other country, they have used very successfully levomethomazine as infusions, as oral medications. We know that corticosteroid has many effects, and it is again a broad spectrum antiemetic. There are many reasons for why it is acting as an antiemetic. I'm not going into details because we know that it will reduce the edema, it will reduce the obstruction. Advanced cancer, we use it as a second line drug for chronic nausea. Antiemetic dose is anywhere from 4 to 8 milligram per day for chronic nausea. Sometimes we go up to 16 to 24 milligram, especially for bowel obstruction. And other commonly used drug would be octreotide. We know that it is a neurotensin VIP substance P. It will reduce all this and decreases the splanchnic blood flow. We'll be dealing again in detail about octreotide in the next class in terms of bowel obstruction. Hyoscine, which is hyoscine butyl bromide or hyoscine hydrobromide, uh, is an anti-muscarinic drug. It will reduce the secretion. It will relax the smooth muscle. Cannabinoids, again, is not available in our country. We have not used it. Benzodiazepine has a central action. So I'll just mention the drugs. Metoclopramide, domperidone, we have seen, haloperidol, olanzapine, levomethormazine, corticosteroids, octreotide, hyoscine, and benzodiazepines. These are the main antiemetics or most commonly used antiemetic in our setting. So we have mentioned a lot about antiemetics and why the patient, where the mechanism lies. So we'll just go to a patient, a 56-year-old male with carcinoma colon. Before moving on to that, is there any question that I need to take up before this, or?
Sridevi, I see there is a chat question.
Yes, sir.
What are the indications for haloperidol? Is it refractory emesis or anything else?
In all the textbooks, in the palliative care textbooks, haloperidol is recommended as the first line drug for opioid induced vomiting. But we tend to use it as a second line. The common cause is that the moment you give haloperidol, people will Google it and say, oh, I'm being prescribed an antipsychotic along with morphine. Already morphine has a lot of stigma. So ideal drug would be haloperidol as a first line drug along with opioid in many textbooks. But it can have some effect like drowsiness along with morphine induced drowsiness. That is why we prescribe it as, but in many countries they still use haloperidol as a first line drug for opioid induced vomiting. But in our setting, we use it as a second line drug. First we prescribe metoclopramide, and then we see whether you need to add on, you need to change it with or replace it with haloperidol.
There is another question. Can you please mention approach as a flowchart?
Which flowchart, sir?
I think the approach to nausea and vomiting as a flowchart, I think. Dr. Avnish. Avnish, can you elaborate on what do you mean? Yeah, Dr. Vinayak says he, yeah, how should we approach a patient? Can we get a simplified flow chart? That's what he is asking.
Sorry, I messed up with the keys. I think I try to include as much as possible in the tables and charts. It's very difficult to say this particular cost, first line, second line, and third line. I'll try to summarize it once again. Sir, if you have some charts simpler than this, you can also share along with the materials. It's not easy to compile everything because as I mentioned, there are multiple causes and multiple receptors involved. So you can just read, okay, symptom one, tick this one, and then give that drug. You have to really go back to the cause, why this patient is vomiting, and then think about which receptor can be involved, and then the appropriate drug. Once you know the receptor, then it is easy. Then you know which drug to be prescribed. I have spread it in a few few slides. It was not possible to include everything in one chart.
Sridevi,
Yes.
before going into that, one comment from Dr. Starlin. Please comment on properazine as a D2 blocker. Yeah, it's Stemetil straight away.
I think I've not mentioned it here because it is not very commonly used. We use prochlorperazine only in vestibular nuclei involved vomiting. For example, some patients will have movement-related nausea and vomiting when you prescribe morphine. It is not uncommon, but we don't see that a lot. But in that case only, we prescribe promethazine or prochlorperazine in a palliative care setting, where you have to block the vestibular nuclei mediated vomiting. I did not include in detail pharmacology of mechanism of action or the duration, as I mentioned about metoclopramide, because it is not very commonly used drug in a palliative care setting. I don't know, I'm messing up with the keys here. I can't mute or unmute. Okay. Doses of metoclopramide I can see in the chart. I've mentioned it in the table, but I didn't want to read it. Here it is. But not, I think I thought I had mentioned. So we start with 10 milligrams 6th hourly. We start with a 40 milligram per day dose. It can go up to 100 milligram for its D2 receptor antagonist action. But if you are intending to use it for a chemotherapy-induced vomiting, then you have to go above 100 milligram per day. But we start with a 40 milligram per day dose. Usually we give it 6th hourly, 10 milligram 6th hourly, and sometimes as a continuous infusion. If you need, if you think that the patient is getting relief intermittently with the intermittent dose, at some cases we have to give it as a continuous infusion. The same dose over a period of time, over 24 hours. I can't see any other questions.
Doctor, I have one more question. Like when you use this doses more than 100 milligrams, do you come across with any of those major side effects like dystonic movements and all those things? Is it frequently happening when you come across when you do more than 100 milligram dose with metoclopramide?
No, the 100 milligram limit is for the D2. If you want a serotonin receptor blocker action also, suppose you are giving it for a chemotherapy induced vomiting, then you have to give above 100 milligram. Even with higher doses, I think in last 8 years, we might have come across 1 or 2 patients with extrapyramidal symptoms, but otherwise, no, not yet. It's not that common, but it is, you have to be suppose the patient is coming with the symptoms, you have to check whether you have been prescribing metoclopramide for a long period of time. Otherwise, I've seen maximum 1 or 2 patients, not more than that. And it is quite reversible with the other drug we give is the promethazine or prochlorperazine you can give. So it is quite reversible if you can identify this as a cause. In Parkinsonism patients, I have not seen any worsening of symptoms. But you have to be just keeping in mind that you are giving a drug which can cause extrapyramidal symptoms or which can exacerbate. Sir, any comment from you? I hope it's not that common.
It's not very common because many of us fear about extrapyramidal side effects, and we hesitate to prescribe metoclopramide. So I have seen only 1 or 2 patients with real extrapyramidal symptoms, even with a single dose. So we usually give up to 100 milligram in bowel obstruction. So we haven't seen much extrapyramidal side effects in those patients. So it is not very common, it's very rare. So it need not cause that you should not write this metoclopramide for patients.
It's a
Yes.
very commonly used drug in our setting. Like all the patients starting with any opioid will be getting metoclopramide. So when you see 1 or 2 cases over 8 years and these many prescriptions, it is very rare. But just to keep it in the back of mind that when you increase the dose, or that when the patient is presenting to you with that symptoms, then you have to know, okay, this can be due to metoclopramide. That's it. I hope I answered your question. I can't see anything more in the chat. I know that it is not like when you hear about the receptor and the centers all together and the drugs, it is quite confusing. I was so confused first time when I heard about nausea and vomiting, but then we come across lot of nausea, vomiting patients on a daily basis. Then you are forced to read again and again, and then you see, okay, this can be the reason. Oh, this is why the patient was vomiting, and this drug actually helped. So then you start enthusiastic about which receptor, which center, and which drug to be used. So I think over practice you will be learning it in a much better way. So we'll move on to a small story with a particular patient. Is a 56-year-old male with carcinoma colon who told that I have persistent vomiting. So I'll take you through various scenarios through which he had nausea and vomiting, and how the management can be different for the same patient. So the same patient is telling you, I have a colicky pain abdomen, abdominal distension and bilious vomiting, and I have not opened bowels for 1 week. Okay. I usually ask people to type the answers in the chat, but I'm not sure whether we have time for that. So why? Because we have to think about gastric stasis or outlet obstruction. In that, we feel okay most of the time, and nausea depends. Sometimes nausea may not be even there. And when you have an outlet obstruction, they feel much better after vomiting. Once all the contents are out, they feel much better. So in your history, you have to ask these questions. Do you have nausea? Do you feel better after vomiting? What is the color of the vomitus? And when do you vomit? Is it immediately after your meal, or is it after long period, like 2-3 hours, and it has nothing to do with food intake? So you have to ask every detail, and whether they have an epigastric discomfort or pain. So what is the mechanism here? There is an obstruction, so there is stretch, there is a release of serotonin from the enterochromaffin cells. So I have mentioned in the box which are the receptors involved. Someone asked about the flow chart, but these are in the different slides, not in a single picture. So these are the receptors involved in terms of obstruction. And how do you manage? Usually we manage with steroids, prokinetics, and something to prevent gastric irritation. And check whether it is drug induced. If it is drug induced, if possible, stop the offending drug. I'm not reading the drugs per se, because we'll be going in detail about bowel obstruction in the next session. So the same patient, a patient with carcinoma colon, is telling you, I've received chemotherapy 3 days ago and I'm vomiting. Again, coming to you telling that I just came for chemotherapy, I'm still vomiting. So there are two situations. So the moment I put these two scenarios because the moment we hear chemotherapy, mind should not run to ondansetron or chemoreceptor trigger zone. There are two scenarios in the chemotherapy scenario itself. He has received chemotherapy already and then vomiting. He's about to get chemotherapy, but having vomiting. So why? When he had chemotherapy, there can be chemotherapeutic agents and anxiety and memory. He knows that last time I vomited really badly. I'm really anxious whether I'll vomit. Or my neighbor told that after the first chemotherapy, I may vomit. So I'm really anxious about vomiting. So chemotherapy, the preferred drug would be something which is serotonin receptor blocker at the CTZ and the GI tract. We know that the drug is ondansetron and granisetron. And if the patient is anxious about the memory of last vomiting or someone scared him of vomiting, then benzodiazepine would be the drug of choice, not ondansetron. So now you know how to relate things, why this particular patient is vomiting and what kind of drug is to be given. So the same patient is telling you that I have vomiting with severe headache and weakness on right half of the body. What could it be possibly? So it can be due to brain mets, meningeal irritation, increased intracranial pressure, because he is telling that he has a headache, vomiting, and a right-sided weakness. So you can see how the vomiting is related to many other symptoms and how you can understand and think about the causes. And the patient is telling you, I have dizziness, vertigo, and head movement causes vomiting. The diagnosis is the same, the patient is the same, and the presenting complaint is still vomiting. But see how many things we can explore from the complaint vomiting, whether you have associated problem when you move the head, you have a vertigo. So we have to go much in detail. You know that vestibular nuclei is involved, and the receptors involved will be histaminic and muscarinic receptors. And I have written what can be the reasons. It can be any cerebral lesions or opioids or any movement. And the patient has been prescribed morphine every 4 hours, and he's telling, I have early satiety and blotting sensation and I have vomiting. So if you stop with the complaint vomiting, then you are unable to explore why he is vomiting. Rather, so even if you have a chart or a flow chart or anything, unless you explore, okay, was there any recent drugs, and whether there is an early satiety, or if you have a blotting sensation, do you have a constipation, do you have an epigastric pain, unless you explore further, we may not be able to come into a cause why he is vomiting. So we have mentioned the receptors, dopamine, serotonin receptors involved in opioid induced vomiting, and the drug of choice would be haloperidol. I said in textbooks, ideally it should be haloperidol, but we use metoclopramide as the first line drug. And if it is still uncontrollable with all these drugs, we can think about switching the opioid to another opioid. And the patient is telling you, I have increased pain over the right upper abdomen, continuous pain I have, and I have pain increased on deep inspiration and loss of appetite. So then we have to think about a possible liver metastasis or anything related to hepatomegaly or edema of the liver capsule. Then your management changes. You cannot just give a metoclopramide or ondansetron or a lorazepam. Then you have to think about something to reduce the edema and thus helping overcoming the vomiting. And the patient is taking aspirin and he has epigastric pain. So then you have to address the gastritis to check whether he is on any PPI, or if not, we have to add PPI. So here PPI would be the drug of choice for controlling vomiting, not any other drug. And the patient is telling you there is a history of fever and diarrhea with vomiting, then you have to think about sepsis. Sore mouth, as I mentioned, candidiasis is very common to cause nausea and unpleasant sensation and even vomiting. Loss of taste and anorexia. Usually they don't tell you that I have a fungal infection on my tongue or mouth. They will tell you I have some bad taste, loss of taste, I don't feel like eating, and I feel nauseous, and sometimes I vomit. I don't feel any taste. So then you have to think about starting and check the oral cavity and think about oral thrush. If so, we have to give antifungal drugs. To summarize, first to start with cause of nausea and vomiting. What can be the cause, or sometimes there will be multiple causes. What is the cause or causes of nausea and vomiting? Start from there. And then you think which pathway is involved, which is triggering this vomiting reflex. And then think, okay, this is through the chemoreceptor sugar zone. So it can be the neurotransmitter involved there. Okay, I know there are serotonin receptors and D2 receptors. What is the drug of choice? Which is the most potent? There may be multiple drugs, as I mentioned, domperidone and metoclopramide. So you have to think which is the most potent one for that particular receptor blocker, which is has more affinity. Then choose that particular antiemetic. Then think about route of administration. Okay, I know which drug is to be given. I know metoclopramide is to be given, but he can't take anything orally. So then he may not be wanted to admit it for a long period of time, or you can choose either subcutaneous or intravenous route. Um, so that think about the choice of drug. Even for the pain medication, if the patient is on morphine and he is continuously vomiting, then we need to think, you can't just keep giving oral medication and thinking that he will be pain free. So you have to choose alternate route, and which will be the best route. Titrate the dose carefully and review the patient frequently. Just don't prescribe and send away the patient. Make sure that they call or you call them back and or review whether this is actually affecting. Uh, Regular antiemetic, not like SOS. When you vomit, you take. No, unless you know the cause, unless you remove the cause, it has to be given regularly. And then once suppose hypercalcemia is corrected, then you may not need an antiemetic regularly. And if still the symptoms are persisting, then bring back the patient again, review all the causes, whether you have missed anything, or you need to send for a referral. You need to think whether there is something else to investigate from a different specialist. So that is to need to be done. And you have to be really careful when you combine multiple antiemetics, whether there is any potential drug interactions. For example, I mentioned metoclopramide and antimuscarinic drug, which has exactly opposite action. So before you combine multiple drugs, I think combining is not a very common practice. We don't see much of combination of antiemetics, but we see a lot of combination of pain medication. But antiemetics, if at all you are combining, think about any potential drug interactions. So that is all about nausea and vomiting. I think we'll be dealing with the constipation along with bowel obstruction.
Okay, thank you, Sridevi. So the session is open for discussion. Anybody has any doubts? Okay. Dr. Dumkumari asks, how long should we prescribe antiemetic?
I must say it depends. Like, for example, I am starting a patient on morphine. Then I will give it for a few days in the beginning, because the nausea and vomiting is completely reversible after first few days of sensitizing your body. But and suppose if the patient is having as I mentioned, hypercalcemia, you don't need to give it for a long period of time. You treat the hypercalcemia, vomiting is fine. Suppose the patient is undergoing chemotherapy. Once the chemotherapeutic drugs is disappearing from the blood, its actions on the CTZ, you don't need to give antiemetics. So it purely depends on the cause why this patient is vomiting, purely. Sometimes we need to give drugs for a long period of time. Sometimes for the bowel obstruction, we may need it for a few weeks in a refractory nausea and vomiting control. So it depends on what is the cause for which you are prescribing an antiemetic, whether the cause is correctable, whether you have already corrected it. So there transdermal formulation, there is a question that whether there is any transdermal preparations. I am not sure, but I have seen scopolamine patches in many countries. And ondansetron, I have seen mouth dissolving small thin paper-like preparations are available, which can be kept on the tongue and it will be dissolved. But for metoclopramide, haloperidol, and drugs we commonly use, I have not seen any preparations other than injections and tablets. Mouth dissolving is there for some of the drugs, but not for metoclopramide or ondansetron. I have seen.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Mouth dissolving tablets for ondansetron, mouth dissolving tablets are also present, and I think haloperidol mouth dissolving tablets is present, but I am not sure about this. And
Patches I have not seen, only
No, no
scopolamine patches
patches.
I have seen in another countries, but not in our place.
Actually, scopolamine is hyoscine hydrobromide, which is not available in India. In India, we have only hyoscine butyl bromide, which is Buscopan. So we don't have transdermal patch. Yeah, Dr. Bismi is asking how to tell if it is opioid-induced vomiting or chemotherapy-induced.
So one thing I mentioned in the scenario is that a patient will tell you more of a dysmotility kind of symptoms of early satiety or feeling of distension many a times when it is opioid, because you know why opioid is causing nausea and vomiting, because of the motility issues. It prevents a lot of kinesis in the GIT. So patients will have more of symptoms mostly related to motility. So you have to ask in detail. Then think. Usually, opioid-induced vomiting is seen when you start a new opioid. Usually, not always, but usually you see the nausea and vomiting when you start with a morphine dose. So you can ask the patient in detail in history what were the drugs, where was it started, associated symptoms like early satiety, constipation, a distension kind of fullness kind of feeling. So you can ask the associated symptoms. So mostly you will be able to pick it from there.
Yeah, I think you will first need to get history about opioids and about chemotherapeutic agents. As Sridevi told, opioids usually causes vomiting only for the first few days, maybe 3 to 5 days, and at the maximum for 1 week. And thereafter, our body gets adjusted to it, and there will not be any vomiting. So that is one history that you can get. And also about chemotherapy. Chemotherapy, there are various types of vomiting: acute vomiting, refractory vomiting, delayed vomiting, breakthrough vomiting. All these are there, but still we will be able to pick up from the history what is it due to opioid induced or is it due to chemotherapy. And if you suspect if it is because of both, then you might need to add one or two drugs together. So I think it is the history. From history, you will get an answer. Anybody else? Yeah, Dr. Jada is asking about uremia induced vomiting. What is the drug of choice? Sridevi, you are muted, I think.
Sorry, sorry. I'm struggling with the keys. There are some changes in the Zoom when it looks okay. So in that you remember that, I don't know whether we are. I'll just show it just quickly. I know that we are going out of time. See, it's easy to we know that it acts at the CTZ and where see chemotherapy and uremia. It acts at the serotonin receptor both in the gut wall and in the area postrema. So you have to use the appropriate drug, which would be the drug that you can use 5-HT3 receptor in the gut wall, or it can be in the CTZ. So you have to use the serotonin blocker, 5-HT3 receptor blocker. I think I should ask the question, which drug? Now you have heard enough from me. Which would be the 5-HT3 blocker that can be used? You can type it in the chat session also, anyone, if you remember something. I can see some of it on Dansetron. Yes. Yes. Any other question? Yes. So I think some of it is being conveyed. So I'm glad that some answers are coming up.
Hello, ma'am. I'm sorry to join late. Basically, I am in Eco Lab this time. I was doing Eco in the and we had an MI patient this time, and we had to symbolize him. So I just joined. So I'm a little bit late today.
I think, sir, we'll be sending the presentation and the link for you to refer.
Okay.
If you have missed.
Yeah, please. Palliative medicine.
So I think we will move on to patient story now. So the summary of this session is that it is important to find out the cause of nausea and vomiting, and then think of which all pathways or on which of the sites this uh, the etiology can act on, like the 5 centers involved in nausea and vomiting, and then prescribe medication as to block that receptor. So it is we have to prescribe medication depending on the receptor which is involved in nausea and vomiting. So ondansetron is not the panacea for nausea and vomiting. We have to select medication as per the pathophysiology of nausea and vomiting. So, Rajlakshmi, can we have the case presentation? So, Dr. Sanath will be presenting the patient story. Dr. Sanath, it's over to you.
Hello.
Yes, Dr. Sanath.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Zannat. Sorry, I cannot communicate. Actually, I couldn't communicate with the video option because I have some internet disturbance here. Sorry for the inconvenience. Can I start my presentation? Hello.
Yes, doctor, you can continue.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Dr. Zannat, working as a pediatric hemato-oncologist in the working is pediatric hemato-oncology department in Dhaka Medical College Hospital in Bangladesh. But the case which I want to present, that is a 12 years old boy is diagnosed as a acute lymphoblastic leukemia with testicular relapse. Next slide, please. He has come with the complaints that is upper abdominal pain, intermittent vomiting, and history of black terry-colored stool, loss of appetite, abdominal distension, and discoloration of skin, especially exposed part. And the child was reasonably well 6 years back. And history of then he came with history of fever, bleeding, and pallor for 1 month. And in this period, he had also history of repeated history of infection, which not treated with or not going better with the antibiotic, and also having history of blood transfusion. And after our clinical examination and some investigation, especially hematological investigation report shows, especially in complete blood count and peripheral blood film and the bone marrow morphological examination results shows some atypical cell and malignant type of blood cell. And after this, flow cytometry for acute leukemia panel was done, and which shows the lymphoblastic leukemia and T cell type, because having CD5 and CD7 was significantly positive in that case. and other but the panel for the B cell or the acute myeloid panel that was absent. And finally, he was diagnosed as a lymphoblastic leukemia, and where in our center, CSF study was done, where it shows the CNS status 1. That is, CSF study shows the negative of the Magnet cell. For this we told it as a CNS status 1. So his final diagnosis was acute lymphocytic leukemia, CNS status 1. Next slide, please. And then after knowing all the disease profile, doctors actually communicate with the parents and other family member, and repeated sitting after the repeated sitting and counseling regarding disease process, regarding the management, what are the adverse effects they may face, and what may be the cost of the patients in this management. After all this sitting and all this counseling, the parents then decided to continue or to start the management. Okay, and then after the real concern, we planned for the management and and chemotherapy, because the chemotherapy is the best option in this case. And he was given chemotherapy according to the specific protocol, that is modified UKLL 2003 protocol. And in that protocol, the main drugs was injection vincristine, daunorubicin, injection L-asparagines, and cetrabine, 6-MP, MTX, and others insignificant drugs. But the whole protocol we have given, that is for the 3.5 years. Because he was boy. And I would like to mention that in that time, because he was in T-cell type acute lymphoblastic leukemia, so he was given a bit in more high risk protocol and intensified drugs. And for this, and duration were more, and he has to give in 3.5 years total duration. But the hoping side is that the patient's father, mother, they are very much gentle and very much active and very much positively motivated, and they take care of the child. Even child was very much positively motivated. In that time, they didn't actually face that much adverse effect. And near about the due time, they completed their whole chemotherapy. And after the completion of chemotherapy, some investigation was done. And this investigation shows that clinically and hematological investigation shows he was in complete remission. And in that time, some investigation was done, that is MRD, that is also negative. So it's a good news for them. And he was in this remission for 18 months. During this 18-month period, he didn't have any complaint. And during this 18-month period, he had come with his family after 3-month interval for follow-up. But when he had come for the last follow-up probably in April to May 2020, come with follow-up with one complaint, that is enlargement in right-sided testis. That was the complaint only. Next slide, please. And on clinical examination, he was well alert and cooperative, affable, and all vitals was normal in that time. Only enlargement of the testis, which was painless, firm, and consistency, and translucence test was negative. And in that time, all the investigations again was done, and all hematological investigation, even complete blood count, peripheral blood film, bone marrow examination for morphology, even MRD, that all are negative. And the CSF study was done, that was also negative. But laparoscopy, biopsy, and histopathology, the right testis shows testicular involvement. That is very unfortunate for the family and the boy. And and in that time, there's a medical board was formed, and all the investigation and clinical examination information, it was decided the diagnosis was acute lymphoblastic leukemia with testicular relapse. And with all these, next slide, please. And with all this information, though it is a heartbroken moment, all doctors faced all this again with the parents and describe all the disease procedure, what may be the further management procedure, what may be the adverse situation in that case, what may be the prognosis. And it was also said that the prognosis may not be better than previous one, and patient may face more adverse effect, more side effect, because in that time the drugs would be more higher concentration and more loaded and more intensified. And after all this thing, patients, at least especially patient mother, was very much positive, and she then again want to start second option, secondly, then as I want to start the management again. So after their concern, management started, and during this management, we had a plan for intensive chemotherapy, and this chemotherapy will be more intensive than previous one, and it was in a CUG protocol and treatment, and that was specified for the extramedullary relapse with acute lymphocytic leukemia cases. And after all counseling and consent of the patient, and then the treatment started. Next slide, please. And in these are the protocol, and he has to cross in this way. This is duration was more or less 1 year, and it is divided into induction phase, consolidation phase, intensification phase, reinduction phase, intensification 2, and then maintenance phase. And all this more or less 56 weeks or 1 year, more or less. And we started his management most probably September, last of the September, and he nicely crossed the induction phase. But when he was in a intensification phase, was getting high dose MTX, recovery rescue 6 MP, and etoposide, cyclophosphamide. In that time, he fell down in severe sufferings. And we have seen that, please, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Patient developed some side effect related to high dose MTX, and that which was gradually decreasing her status, and gradually increasing the side effect related problem. And in that time, he was febrile, gloomy, very much depressed, and blackish discoloration of the whole body and skin, especially exposed part, oral ulceration grade 2 to 3, unstable vital parameters, sometimes BP not recorded, and reduction of urine output gradually. And sorry, would I continue?
Yes, doctor, you can continue.
And some hematological and biochemical investigation also done. In that time, it was also alarming. We have seen that pancytopenia with very severe neutropenia, that is ANC, that is absolute neutrophil count, was 60 initially, then 20. And raised serum creatinine level, that was gradually increasing. D-dimer level also increased, prolonged PT, and the prothrombin time and APTT was also prolonged, and reduced our serum potassium level and calcium level was decreased. In that time, COVID test was negative, but blood culture and urine culture shows no other growth. But other investigations are done to detect any acute pancreatitis or acute abdomen related investigation, but that investigation shows no significant role. And next slide, please. The patient, 12 years old boy, that he was completely well 1.5 years after completion of first chemotherapy schedule. And the boy was very much jovial and playful, and he was very much positive minded. And he was, after completion of first chemotherapy, he planned what he will do in the next. and he was the only child. The pathetic thing is he's the only child of their in that families and have a very much good relation with their parents. And he loves reading storybook and music, loves painting, and go in the outside sightseeing was his actually the hobby. And child was a very much, but in that situation, he was very much worried about his present status, especially unable to eat and the sleep disturbance and skin discoloration and sometimes fear for the death also. And he communicate just inform all these things sometimes with the doctors, even nurses also. Next slide, please. And parents knew about all the illness and its prognosis previously and in this time also. Parents was practicing Muslim and pray every day for their child. And but the actually the his mother was very much vulnerable in that time. It is very natural also. And another negative is that the family came from a very low socioeconomic condition, but they had a very they were very encouraged to fight with this adverse situation. So in this situation, what medication actually we plan in that time? Nothing per oral, and stop all the chemotherapy in that situation, and the free displacement therapy according to the need of the child. And as because he was diagnosed as a febrile neutropenia with septicemia, all the broad spectrum antibiotics like injection meropenem, vancomycin, injection metronidazole, all was given. Injection omeprazole, injection ondansetron, and ganisetron, SOS was given for vomiting, and trimethoprim sulfate for the pain in the abdomen, and injection quinaquine, FFP, fresh frozen plasma, singular platelet, and RCC was all the blood product was given according to the need of the baby. Injection folinic acid was given just to minimize the side effect of high dose MTX. And oral an acid oral session mixed with steroid and riboflavin, and the acyclovir was given just to minimize the oral ulceration. After he bath 2 to 3 times daily, just maintaining. Actually, it was maintained from the first day of chemotherapy. And correction of electrolytes imbalance as far as possible, and merging all the vitals and the biochemicals and the hematological parameters, and change the posture, though patient's condition was worsening. So in this situation, main concern, I think one of the main concern is how to address, next slide, please. Next slide, please. In this situation, our main concern is, one of the main concern is how to address the emotional and psychological distress of the parents regarding the child status, and the blacky discoloration of the skin, and unable to eat and sleep. Next slide, please. A 12-year-old boy was diagnosed of acute lymphoblastic leukemia along with testicular relapse. He was suffering from febrile neutropenia, septicemia, impaired renal function, vomiting, anorexia, malignant, abdominal pain, and discoloration of the skin after receiving high-dose chemotherapy. Next slide. Discussion point to this case presentation may be the best possible way to alleviate the sufferings of this family, and parents concerned about the chemotherapy and recovery. And third point is communication with the doctors and caregiver or parents, and communication with the doctors and patients.
Thank you, doctor. So we have a boy with relapsed acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and the questions are, and I think there is one question I have seen in the chat regarding the case presentation. Why laparotomy was done in this case?
As because testicular enlargement, and so it was indicated that we have to go for biopsy and histopathology whether there is extramedullary involvement or not. Actually it was a recommended schedule according to the management. If any involvement, because he has a possibility, because initially he was suffering from acute lymphocytic leukemia, that is T cell type, and in T cell type there is a chance for testicular involvement, CNS involvement, and mediastinal involvement. There is a chance, but initially he didn't have any CNS involvement, and X-ray chest shows or CT scan shows no mediastinal involvement. But clinically, as because he has come with testicular enlargement, in that times it was actually mandatory.
Thank you, Dr. Sana. What can be done to alleviate the suffering of the family? Anybody can comment on this? Anybody? I think most of the questions are connected questions. The best possible way to alleviate the suffering of the family and communication with doctors and parents. Yeah. Regular counseling. Does palliative care approach even advocate such intensive chemotherapy? So that's what Dr. Avanish asked. Dr. Sanas, there is another question. Why? What is the reason for discoloration? Is it due to methotrexate?
Yes, actually, for the when methotrexate was given in any patient when it is high dose, in that case that is exfoliation, that is mucosal erosion, that is either internally and externally, and it is a part exfoliation, that is a darkening and a new actually skin actually started after the exfoliation. It is a one of the side effect. It is a known side effect actually, but sometimes may having more side effect, sometimes may not having more side effect. That is genetically determined actually. In that case, the boy having more side effect. Another thing is that in this schedule actually 4 dose of high dose MTX. So he first crossed the first high dose MTX, and he shows this kind of side effect actually in second stage, when secondly he was exposed with high dose MTX.
Okay. What happened to this boy, Dr. Sanas?
Sorry, I cannot.
What
Can you make it clear?
what happened to this boy at last?
Actually, yeah, he's in Mandasli. He's in now. He's in ICU. Renal function a bit recovered, and he's actually septicemia a bit partially recovered. He's a bit improving, but he's not out of danger now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What is going to be the prognosis of this boy?
Actually, in this protocol, if he can cross it, prognosis better, best prognosis. But the adverse thing is that, or the bad thing is that that is the more drugs and high and in intensified protocol. That is the danger thing. But if he can cross this, it is a prognosis best.
Okay. So I see there are many questions, but one question was the family offered palliative care option as an alternative to such high dose chemotherapy? Dr. Sanat?
Hello. Uh, can you please repeat this? Actually,
Did this patient, did this family was given the option of palliative
yeah,
care?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, that was one question.
Yeah, I have. We have when second times when chemo was given. In that time, we have given them the palliative option because the chemo was very high dose and having more side effect, and sometimes patient can tolerate this, and they don't have that much monetary support, and it is in a COVID situation. All this we described them, but
Mm,
they denied with a hope they wants to cross this, because actually why they were hopeful, because initially they crossed the chemotherapy protocol very nicely, and said and for this and they thought that this time they can cross this, though doctors informed them many times it may be it may not be that soothing way, but they were very much confident, and they concerned, yeah, we will go for management through this in this way. We want to, and that is their full concern. We already told them we can go
yeah.
for palliative, and in this time patient may survive 5 to 10 years. In this way we also say, and we gave some example of them, but they don't want actually.
Okay. So I think Sridevi, can you comment on the best possible way to alleviate suffering of the family and communication with doctors and parents?
So the one thing, not this particular patient, maybe a takeaway point is that, especially when you deal with children, I think the first thing should come from within us, how far we accept the prognosis. Although we think that we accept the bad prognosis or the suffering, when it comes to a child, we are constantly in a dilemma inside us whether this is the right way to advocate for this. If this bridge is crossed, then it is fine. So first thing would be acceptance from our side that children can also possibly die, or they can have much more problem with the quality of life. And I would really recommend talking to the family almost every day. Because anytime their decision can change, because the things are changing on a daily basis. He's not the same person before starting the intense chemo or before the side. He may not be the same person 1 hour before and 1 hour after some investigation. So the constant conversation on a daily basis about risk versus benefit, where he is now, what can be done, because as treating physicians, it's very difficult for us to give up on a child. So what about the parents with the only child, and that child who has crossed one difficult task in the past, so they rely completely upon that child. So regular conversation with the parents and regular convincing within ourselves is really important. And the second thing, so this is the first thing. Second thing would be how far the child wants this to go on. He's a 12-year-old boy, not a very small boy who do not understand anything. I think he has understood, as you were mentioning, he is a very enthusiastic child in the beginning. So I guess he understands what he is going through, what are his options, and it is very high time that we talk about him about the prognosis in very clear terms. Because for them it is, maybe they'll be thinking like in the past we'll be overcoming this also, but we know from the picture that it is not the same bridge that he's crossing this time. It is a different bridge, different place. So I think these are the two things in general, especially when you deal with children. First realization from within us, we have to be really confident, which is we have to be confident to give up on something, uh, so that the suffering is much lesser. And second thing would be regular daily conversation, maybe 2 times a day conversation with the parents, because they need constant reminders about how things are going, and talking to the child. He's a boy who can understand, I guess, 12-year-old.
Yeah, so there is no shortcut or magic by which we can alleviate the suffering of the family because their only child is suffering. So, as Sridevi told, we have to talk to the family and make them understand what is going on and what can be done from your part to reduce the suffering of the patient so that the family suffering will also be less. Uh, and uh, Many times we misunderstand that this children doesn't understand anything, but actually they do understand all the things about the disease and its prognosis. And what happens is usually when they come for chemotherapy, there will be many other children who is also with the child, and they will talk uh, among themselves. They will get their phone numbers and will have messages, etc. After some time, somebody will die, and then this child may ask, "Where is the other so and so?" So the one child may tell he died 2 days back. So they understand all those things about uh, uh, what is going on, and they actually pretend that they don't know. Uh, that is because they don't want their parents to suffer, their parents to become emotional. We had a 14-year-old boy who usually don't show any emotion because he want his parents to be comfortable. Whenever he cries, the parents will also start crying with him. He actually knew about all about his disease, but he didn't actually express it all to the parents. So maybe this child will also know about the disease, and it is very important that we can talk to him and also take his opinion regarding the treatment. Whether this high dose chemotherapy it is causing more suffering. Do you want to continue with it, or shall we stop? And what is the other method of continuing chemotherapy? All this can be discussed with this boy because he will be knowing many of those things, and with parents we have to talk everything about uh, yeah, Dr. Dogan Kumari says true, but from the point of parents, it is not easy to give up on their child. Yeah, that's true. This will happen to everybody. This will happen to each and every person. It is not easy to give up. But then we have to suppose the treatment is not is going to give more of a problem for the child, and it is not causing much benefit for the child. Then sometimes the parents may be going okay, I don't want our child to receive chemotherapy because it is causing more side effects. It is not easy to give up, that's true, but still when it is more of suffering, then some people may select they don't opt for chemotherapy, or maybe uh, some other methods of chemotherapy. uh, so it is important for us to understand that when we suffer we think that okay, we are suffering, but the child is also suffering, which what we have to understand. Okay, there are many comments. So, Sridevi, do you want to add anything more?
I just put the chat. It's not easy to give up on the child, but it is not. No one would want the child to suffer also. As Dr. Avnish was mentioning, they might not have anticipated the suffering for their child. They thought it is like first time and they will overcome this, but it may not be the same. So reminding them about what their child is going through on a regular basis, not just one conversation can fix this. So regular basis conversation is highly recommended in this.
The parents actually need good support, social support, not only from us, that means the medical team, but also from the family. Suppose that if the parents have brother or sisters, they will also need to support them because they are going through an emotional trauma. Yeah, and regarding chemotherapy and the recovery, I think you will be the better person to talk about that. But it should be talked properly, and the parents should know all about what is going to happen.
So they will be having communication sessions, or they already had communications?
I think they finished the communication session.
Because there are some questions regarding what if the parents don't give consent to talk to the child. I think that might have dealt in how to deal with collusion.
Yeah. So that is pollution, and we have to actually talk to the parents and make them understand the importance of talking to the child, and then this will take many sessions. Not with a single session you will get an answer. So please refer how to manage pollution. So I think yeah.
Sir, I think I just want to mention one thing.
Yeah.
The child was very much positive, and when their parents gave the consent, in that time, child was also gave a positive thumb also in that time, and it was very surprising for us also. Yeah, and every time all the treatment related, all the information actually carried by this boy, because he is directly he was actually directly communicating with the doctors every time. Very positive boy actually, and that is actually that is the main sorry feelings for us. What should we do in this situation actually?
Okay. So then it's he knows all the things, so it is easy for you to talk to him regarding how to go forward.
Thank you, sir.
So I think we can wind up the session. Thank you, Dr. Sanath, for a very good patient story and very interactive case discussion. Uh, Thank you, Sridevi, for being with us and having a wonderful session on nausea and vomiting. Thank you all. Rajlakshmi, it's over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam, and thank you all for patience hearing.
Thank you all. We can see you next Wednesday with a continuation of gastrointestinal symptoms with constipation and bowel obstruction. So we have shared the feedback link. Give it a minute, do it, then only leave the meeting. We will see you next Wednesday.